in the Steiner movement, hardly anybody has ever touched taxation. That's just a fact. I was once asked to write a book by a banker. Will you write a book about Rudolf Steiner and taxation? Because nobody has followed up what he says. It's not totally true. There is in Germany, he's now deceased, a man called Benedictus Hardorp. I think he was a tax lawyer, something like this. That was his profession, and a very serious one, a very serious profession, and he was a serious player in that profession. But he was a Steiner person, and then he did a lot of looking into taxation. Not only what did Steiner say about taxation, but how does that play out in the world of taxation, including the complicated story of value-added taxation. So he was very active in doing this, but I think I don't know of anybody else, actually. I do know one other person. That's not true. I know one other person. He's also deceased. He lived in San Diego in the United States. He was in the Steiner movement, and he was a member of Citizens Against Taxation. But he's the only other person. That's two people in the whole world that I know professionally as Steiner people have touched on taxation in any serious way. And the guy in the United States, I said, well, that's a problem because, don't involve me in your Citizens Against Taxation, because in there you have a story. And now you politicize something, and I suggest you don't go down that path because you'll be up in the hills with your gun waiting for the whatever you're waiting for. And you have an anti-federal, you have a big story inside Citizens Against Taxation. And I suggest you back away from that. And I'll give you one other example. Not many people have these examples, but for a long time, I published a journal about associative economics. And then I had a reader who I never met. And he wrote to me once, it was about 25 years or so ago. He wrote to me once in desperation. And he said, look, I'm a Steiner person, so I read my Steiner, and I understand what he means about income taxation. This little story, we can come to it in a moment. And because of that, I have refused to pay income tax for a very long time to the IRS in New York. I said, so now I'm on trial. And I want you to write a character witness or some kind of written evidence in support of my position. And I wrote to him, I said, I respect you're a reader of my journal. I don't actually know you. I had to write this. So when it was quoted, I was protecting myself. I don't actually know you. I get that you read my journal, but I don't share your interpretation of Steiner income tax. And I'm sorry, I can't support your argument. And he got 20 years in prison.
Wow.
And I know he did, and I know he's out because I know a lady who runs a kind of prison outreach scheme in the United States. And I asked her, do you know this person? And she said, oh yeah, he was released 4 years ago. He did 20 years because he was so insistent. His interpretation of income tax by Steiner meant he didn't have to pay any. And I said, that's not my interpretation, and don't mess with taxation unless you really know what you're doing, is my point. Mm-hmm. And so I can tell you these stories. And then if you look at what Steiner actually said, he says very little. And you've pointed to where he particularly speaks about it, in English anyway, in the lectures on so-called social future. And there, if you have the 1948 edition, this very important edition, or 1944 maybe it was, they were edited by a guy called Bernhard Behrens, who's a German Steiner person who ended up living in LA, in Los Angeles. And he wrote in the back of that edition, 1944 edition, an explanation for the Anglo-Saxon mind, what Steiner means about income taxation and expenditure taxation. And if you go to that, this is not Steiner extrapolating. This is this German-American trying to explain what Steiner's meaning. And it's a very important thing you mentioned because it's almost a unique place to find it, where Steiner says, or seems to say, we need to come away from taxing income. I won't go into the whole story, come away from taxing income. Well, even if you say that today, he's saying this in maybe 1919 Social Future Lectures, but you have to be acutely aware. Two things, at least in United States history, when the Federal Reserve was created in 1913 on this strange night on the 23rd of December, blah, 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 that was to create the Federal Reserve banking system. It wasn't to involve itself in income taxation, but it did. But the people who put the thing together at the beginning had no intention of doing this. You can find this in the biography of Henry Goldman's granddaughter. So all these stories get complicated. But the Goldman Sachs company in New York, the big, the ones who lost a ton of money in 2008 and got it all back the next day from the US Secretary, Treasury or whatever. The Goldman Sachs company, it was originally two Jewish banking families from Frankfurt who went to New York, and they served the New York community of Jewish people. And they gradually, they became one company, Goldman Sachs. But then Henry Goldman said, just on the Goldman Sachs story, he said, now the Sachses are serving themselves, they're not serving the Jewish community. So they separated. And they made a deal that Goldman Sachs can retain the name Goldman Sachs, but the Sachs and the Goldmans had nothing to do with each other after that. Because the Sachs were intent on serving themselves. And the Goldmans said, no, we're here to serve our community. This is a very important story to know. But the same guy, Henry Goldman, the head of Goldman, he was on this committee that created the Federal Reserve Committee. And his granddaughter says, he said, when they came to sign the final document, as it were, there were references to income taxation, which were nothing to do with the banking system, and he didn't know where they came from, but they were not in the original documentation. So I say that because when Steiner touches, or when anyone touches income tax, you have to know there's something going on here. And then again, in the case of the United States, but it's more generalized, you come to the mid-1930s, the introduction of pay-as-you-earn, where the government institutes taxation on income as its primary source of revenue, not only income on businesses, but income on private citizens. And this becomes sort of by statute. You will send us tax every day. No, there's nothing to discuss about this. This is now a kind of, if you avoid taxation, if you avoid income tax like this poor guy in New York, you are stealing money from the state, and the state knows what to do with such people. It's pretty brutal. And so I get into this anecdotal, what's really out there, and what is Steiner saying in that context? Well, he says this complicated story that you're referring to, that we need to move away from income taxation, not to avoid tax, this is important, but to make clear the instance of tax is real and viable and does what we think it's going to do, right? So he's not questioning taxation. He's questioning the incidence and the effect of any taxation. That's why he talks about direct and indirect. But then the actual example he gives, he makes it immediately complicated because it looks like he's saying we have to go away from income tax to taxing expenditure, which you might think is like a sales tax. So if it's a sales tax, why didn't he say sales tax? With Steiner, you have to be very careful not to think he doesn't choose his words carefully. Right? So if he meant sales tax, why didn't he say sales tax? Because especially in the United States, we know what sales tax is. It's everywhere, right? It's everywhere, especially in the country that doesn't do VAT. The United States doesn't do VAT. So VAT is a modern invention from the 50s. So even if you go back in my country, we had sales tax. It's not the same thing as VAT. All this is hugely subtle and complicated. I won't go into the story of VAT because it just makes it even more difficult. And so Steiner is not talking about sales tax. And then when he describes what he's saying, according to Behrens' explanation at the back of this book, and according to my understanding of what Behrens is trying to say, Steiner's sort of saying you don't tax income, you tax capital when an entrepreneur takes hold of it. This is not expenditure tax. or this is certainly not sales tax. So I'm going into some detail because it's the only instance I know that Steiner speaks about it. In his mind, is very precise. You've got translation problems from German to English. You have Behren's commentary, which is very, I think, valid and a powerful commentary. But my translation of it, my understanding of all this is actually he's saying, when an entrepreneur takes hold of capital, you tax that. I'm not saying that is what Steiner means, but that's what I've got to. And if you try and then work this out, you will probably, if it's true, I'm saying, you will probably arrive with an argument for taxation, which does a number of things. It makes sure the incidence is real economically and not a kind of political instrument. So this is never going to fly in a place like Argentina. Anything that moves in Argentina gets taxed. So of course, nothing moves. Everything is done under the table because if you move, you're going to get taxed. So there's no logic in taxation in a place like Argentina. Well, there is a logic, but it's the logic of the government. So his concern is where economically does tax should be the incidence? What is the effect you're trying to have? And do you have that effect? And I think he has in the back of his mind, ultimately, it's something to do with equitable distribution of wealth is what we're trying to achieve here. So if you have a village and it has a fire engine, we don't all need a fire engine in the village. We need one. And so if if that's owned by the village, the way it's going to be funded is by everybody pays a tax, or what we would call a tax. It's just a form of an invoice from the village to me for my part of the fire engine costs. We can call that that's a tax. I'm not going to pay it. I'm going to try and avoid it. Or you can say that's the way where I pay my part, and the benefit to me is a fire engine when I need it. Mm-hmm. So he's going in this direction, and he's trying to get clear what is the true basis of taxation, what is it really needed for, and meaning where is it an imposition on economic life which is not going to succeed anyway, going to create a huge world of evasion and the whole industry of accountants who love the world of evasion. So they're not interested in what Steiner says about taxation because they live on the evasion of tax. So they love all the taxes which invite evasion, which is, don't underestimate. That's the most part of what an accountant spends his time doing, advising you how to evade tax. That's not what they call it, but that's what I call it, right? So don't think anyone's going to be really interested in rethinking the tax system. But I can tell you again, I've never been investigated for tax. I'm self-employed, so you're under constant surveillance, if you like. I've never been investigated. I've been twice inquired into, which means I have heavy-duty interviews by tax officers that go into your account 7 years backwards. You don't want that to happen too often because it's very time-consuming. But I know what it means. And so in those people, in those cases, I've had conversations with actual tax inspectors. Okay, along the way, we've talked about what taxation is and what its place is. And is it real that the neoliberals want to remove taxation from the world? I don't think so. If they do, they have an enemy in the tax person. But if you can show to a tax officer that he or she has a future revenue stream arrived at differently, that's a different discussion than being a tax avoider that he's trying to get you to, And again, I said unashamedly, anecdotally, I know a lot of things from this point of view. And I know that in Steiner's larger image, taxation is actually critical to understand what is the true basis of taxation. Is it going to be based, as it was in the past, on the might of the king to take it from you? Or is it going to be based on the king in you who says, this is just a shared cost of doing business? We need to be clear that it's a legitimate cost. But basically, it's in an associative world, wouldn't I, share the cost of the village fire engine? I wouldn't be trying to avoid my part on it, or if I did, I would expect it not to arrive when I wanted it to, because I haven't contributed. But hardly anybody has touched this wand, because to touch income taxation, you're taking on the federal government of the United States head on. And most governments are in this mindset. And so It's another example. There's a good reason why people don't touch this. They're not soul capable of comprehending what the hell is going on in this world, and they'd just rather pay their income tax and find the ways around it and everything else than understand where taxation is going in its whole evolution. And I don't know anybody who's concerned themselves with that. I know a lot of people, Citizens Against the Taxation. There's a guy in England, Richard, I can't think of his name now, a big noise in tax reform. He wants nothing to do with Steiner's ideas. He's caught up in the Robin Hood kind of taxation system. Then you have all the Tobin tax people who think you should tax money flows. This is not anything Steiner suggests, who are not coming out of any logic of taxation. They're coming out of a logic of sharing the spoils, sharing the profit someone else has made. And so again, I've said a lot, but I said it because in the world of Steiner, I don't know anybody except Benedictus Hardorf who has ever bothered to even look at this in any systematic way, mindful of what would have to change in the world for Steiner's ideas to be given any serious listening.